The goal of Data Transformers podcast is to accelerate digital transformation by bridging the gap between business outcomes and rapidly advancing technologies. And we aim to bridge this gap by focusing on data. I am Peggy Tsai, top 50 women in tech influencer, co-author of the AI book, and data governance expert.
I'm Ramesh Danta, an entrepreneur, a tech blogger, and AI enthusiast.
So just going back to your professional journey, I mean, one question we always ask our guest speakers is how they made the transition from one role to another. And it seemed like you worked at so many, many companies. Can you talk a little bit about what triggered your decision? Starting from your first job, like what triggered your decision to change roles? Was it you wanted to learn and grow more, or you felt that there's a better opportunity? So I'm just curious about how you made all those transitions in your professional journey.
Well, me personally, I've always been, attracted to disruptive innovation. So when I got the opportunity to jump on TiVo, that was an exciting innovation. The ability to start the first Android smartphone, that was an innovation that I wanted to be part of. So those were the core of what my transition decisions were, was jumping on that next innovation.
So Dale, actually, I'm trying to connect your professional journey with respect to dealing with the data over a period of time, but different sets of companies, right? So now you're dealing with the video related data with your video, the AI thing, right? So yeah. What changes, the evolution have you seen about the company's perspectives about data, like how they work with data over the period of time? And then is it more increased focus on quality? What have you been seeing over the period?
I guess data has always been important to business. But the scale that we can manage data has changed dramatically in the last decade, right? Interesting story. At TiVo, I drove the requirements in the construction of the first recommendation engine based on both the TV guide metadata as well as the consumer behavioral data that we had access. Kind of what Netflix does today, but Netflix is way more advanced because they have way more data and way more usage information than we had, but that was all data-based. And the famous story about that, one reporter who had a TiVo wrote about, he thought his TiVo thought he was gay because it recommended to him some gay comedy because he watched two different shows that happened to correlate to that comedy. So you can easily make mistakes if you don't have enough data to accomplish the task. But now with GPUs and massive cloud farms of computers, the amount of data that a business can manage effectively has gone up 10 orders of magnitude what it was then.
I mean, Dale, it's very obvious to anyone listening to this episode that you have you're the expert in video AI. And you mentioned earlier in your business community, yet you welcome students to join the community. I'm curious what type of advice you give to students who are learning in this field right now. Like what type of advice they should take in terms of either learning something specifically, or should they have more industry experience? Like what's the most helpful type of advice you can give students today?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the AV8AI community is a business community. So we focus on making successful businesses in this space. And beyond building the right ecosystem, which is critical given the technology evolution rate as it is, to me, number one is always understanding what the customers value. And a lot of people will be impressed by a particular innovation in the technology domain, but if you can't translate that effectively into a consumer value point, you'll never make a good business. So it's that's something that I continually remind students and seasoned entrepreneurs that the customer is the one who pays the bills and is all important in business.
Unfortunately, they don't teach that in graduate schools today. It's not a course.
Well,
So
Amazon is quite famous for having this discipline, right? I mean, Amazon, they actually take it to extreme. They don't even care what competitors do. They focus on doing the best they can for the customer, and they feel that they win. And so far, they've demonstrated that they can win, ignoring competition, just doing what the customer tells them is valuable.
So is that something students should just, learn on the job, or hope that their first few jobs teaches them about what customers want? I mean, I'm just saying that it's not a very common.
Yeah, the Amazon takes it to extreme. I mean, they're an example where they've totally honed that, and they've demonstrated they can make that successful. So I like to hold them up as an example of the extreme case. Most other companies, our former employer Intel, on the other hand, cares about their competition, defending their monopoly, and their focus was more about killing the competition than it was about making the customer happy. So very different cultures between the two. I think the Amazon culture is healthier, although I feel it's a little extreme, completely ignoring competition, but they have a way of incorporating competition in the way they develop their customer solution. So they officially they ignore it, but technically it's part of the process, so it's not ignored.
So Dale, I mean, towards the last phase of this podcast, we typically explore the trends and then which ones are going to near term and which are going to be long term. And now let me actually start even broader than video AI. So in the AI space, right? So first, I want to ask you a question. Where does video portion of the AI fit into? Is it still a lot more work needs to be done for businesses to extract ROI from it? Are there segments where the video is really advanced, where the artificial intelligence aspect of it? For example, the thing that comes to my mind is the healthcare, right? Healthcare, not from a surveillance perspective, healthcare more from a diagnosis perspective, right? So it seems like there are advances being made. So the question is, in the broader AI, is the video AI is leading the AI effort, or where is it?
So the place where they're making a lot of progress in medicine is things like picking out interesting areas in x-rays or medical images. There's a company that I am familiar with where they're taking NMR or scans of the heart, and they're actually measuring the occlusion of each vessel within the heart in order to diagnose whether you need a stent or not without intrusively going in and looking to see how blocked it is. So those kinds of things, that's all AI-based matching and measurements that they use to deliver that. So under those very tightly constrained, they control how the imager is set up, and they control the test set, and they can define places where it doesn't operate. Don't use it on these type of people, or don't use it on this kind of condition. But if you can say, oh, we've trained it specifically on these kinds of conditions with specifically these kinds of people, then you can feel pretty confident on the data that you get out of that very tightly constrained environment. Again, I'll get back to the more general and unconstrained the problem you try to solve with vision, that's where it gets intractable for today's technology. But if you can control a lot of the variables, and it's much more tractable as long as it's posed as a recognition problem. There are other problems that aren't yet solved as well. The recognition problems are pretty good under constrained conditions.
And that's actually very interesting. You brought that example because we had a previous podcast speaker talk about using AI on X-rays and to check whether or not the patient had COVID-19 or not, and being able to collect large sample sets from the diverse population, and putting labels and features to do that, and produce an algorithm that actually we're able to predict it. So it seems like, as you said, very controlled situations, and I love that it's in the healthcare space, because it sounds like it has a lot of great benefits, and as you said earlier, like the health and gym, that kind of space as well. I'm curious what other examples there are where such focalized, controlled use cases would benefit people in the future too.
In the future or today?
Well, today and the future, either one.
Yeah, well, the ones behind the scene, there's a lot of MarTech use of computer vision. They use them for detecting how often brands appear in certain types of content. So they're doing logo counting, that kind of recognition. They're using it for even, like I said, brand safe advertising. So detecting what the content is of the video to determine whether or not a baby ad belongs with that content, or whether they should replace it with something more aligned with what is in that content, if it's adult or violent, or some other thing that would be incompatible with the brand of the advertiser that they're showing. So there's already stuff like that being deployed.
Mm-hmm.
There's also ad personalization, which is more data-driven AI than it is visual-driven AI, but it's just in the beginnings of doing that.
What about the concept of customer sentiment? Do you think video AI would ever be at a point where it can read people's reactions to an advertisement and then gauge whether or not something like that would be is a successful campaign or not? Like, do you think that's
Yeah, they're doing that already. There's a company called Effectiva in Boston that they sell their services in emotion recognition, and they use it, just like you said, to determine how viewers are responding to advertisements and getting their emotional.
That's scary, Dale. So now I'm really scared.
Market technology, yeah, that's definitely how it's done.
I know it's Orwellian, right? Which is like, I'm sitting, all I want to do is watch a TV, some program. Now you're telling me they're going to track my eyes to see if I'm paying attention or not.
Yeah, they watch where you're looking. It's like, are you looking at the woman's eyes, or are you looking at some other part of her body? And they'll have that data.
That's very sad. Yeah. So along those lines, my question is, for example, what are the big barriers? I'll give an example. In the electric vehicle market, the battery technology was seen as a big barrier. If you solve that, then the cars can go longer, and then you can charge the faster kind of stuff. So that becomes a big barrier. If you solve it, then a lot of advancements can be made. So likewise, in the space that you're operating in, visual AI, are there any big barriers that once you solve them, then the field will open up a lot more opportunities?
Well, I think compute continues to get cheaper and faster, but it's still not there yet for the more complex. Like I said, if you get to the point where you're modeling the scene and doing comparisons in a modeled 3D world, that we're not there yet, but it's on the horizon. A few more orders of magnitude compute performance, and you can get to systems that can do that. But I think right now we're pushing the limits of what we can deploy with the current semiconductor technology at the certain cost, but that's advancing very rapidly. So I'm optimistic that we're constrained by it, but it's still advancing quickly. So we continue to make progress.
So, okay, out of the compute and storage is not an issue, but the ability to real-time compute and then inference and then give the result, that's where the barrier is.
Correct.
Hmm.
And the cost of that, right? I mean, cost and time, both are relevant factors. And if you include edge cases like automobiles and other devices like that, power becomes a significant issue. So, already the stuff that they deploy in Waymo and some of these other self-driving vehicles consume a considerable amount of the I guess the range of the electric battery of the electric car. So it's a problem.
So I feel like we can never have a conversation about AI without talking about ethics. Ramesh is nodding his head because, and I just want to know your thoughts on that, Dale, because it just seems like all the examples we were talking about, it is somewhat invasive in terms of people's privacy, but it's also helpful, other, use cases where it's definitely helpful and beneficial. So love to hear what your thoughts are on, ethics in video AI and how it can be managed, or, what can be done to control it. What are your thoughts?
Actually, to add to what Peggy said, facial recognition, we have not even touched upon, right? I mean, there's huge ethical implications of that one. And especially in some areas of law enforcement, it's restricted. So I think I really want to double up on Peggy's question. I want to get your opinions on that.
Sure. So I think first, let's sort of separate the issues of privacy from, I guess, the issues of bias, because they're really separate issues. For privacy, I think we bump up into that more because we're more surveillance oriented and more out remotely gathering information that are in what have traditionally been sensitive areas. Even though consumers have put up with security cameras in shopping malls and grocery stores for years, the expectation there is they're looking for criminals stealing stuff off the shelf, or trying to rob somebody. But what's happening is that those cameras are watching you pick stuff off the shelf and seeing which brands you engage with and which ones you aren't, and they're able to provide that back to the manufacturers and advertisers to make targeted ads that target you as a demographic, as a male who's a certain age and certain geography, and say he likes this brand, we should target more ads at him so he buys more of our products. So that's not a current expectation of what's going on with these surveillance cameras, but the technology is there to do that. And I think from a privacy perspective, our society, our culture hasn't grappled with the fact that I actually want to control. If somebody's looking at me getting that kind of data, I actually want to control how it's used. I want to own my behavioral data. I don't want it generally sellable to anybody, because it's me and it's my privacy, and I don't really want to render that out to other people. So but it's coming. We need to deal with that, and we need to deal with it soon, because it's already here. It just hasn't hit. And we put up with it with Facebook and Google too, but I'm of the same mind that they use my data in ways that I don't approve of, and they don't give me any control to disapprove of it. So I'm not happy about that. But the bias issue is a completely different one. In my mind, unfortunately, a lot of times the technology reflects the bias of the humans that are implementing it. So it's not, the bias isn't implicit in the technology. The bias is implicit in the users of the technology. So
correct.
The only real way to eliminate the users of the technology to get rid of those biases ultimately. But before then, you can have checks and best practices that try to reduce them. But unfortunately, humans are biased in general.
So that actually, that's a good point. So Peggy and I talked to a couple of other people who focus on ethical aspects of it. And yeah, with respect to bias, I think that's a challenge that has to be dealt with. There are a lot of examples where the training data itself has bias. Then what do you do on top of it in the inferencing that you remove the bias, as opposed to blaming the technology that has included the bias in it. So
Yes,
100%
the
agree with
technology
that.
is not biased, right? The concern is that the technology reflects the existing biases that are in the data. So
Yeah.
that's problematic.
So with that, Dale, are there any areas that that are near and dear to you that we have not touched upon as we conclude this podcast?
Well, I think we touched on it briefly, but I want to, I guess, restate it because it is something that I think it is really important, and that is using visual behavioral analytics to improve caregiver situations. So whether it's nanny or child care or elderly care, there's a significant deficit in the amount of humans that are available to care for other humans. And I think this kind of technology can augment and help improve the lives of people that require care. And I'm excited about it, and I'm pushing in many different ways to accelerate the adoption of that so that we can take better care of our at-risk populations or our populations that really need additional help.
Actually, I want to conclude on that one, but I have a small question on that. One of the things is that, is there money in whatever use case we're talking about, right? So it's a good thing to do, right? Elderly care, child care, especially when we don't have people who care for others. But is there, for businesses who want to go into that, can they make money with this one, or still there are cost barriers to deliver a compelling solution?
So the average cost across the U.S. is like $19,000 a year for in-home care. That's the average. And they're like 13, 14 million unskilled caregivers in the U.S. And they're making an average of $20,000. That's a decent sized market. But that's just the unskilled. There's also skilled and nursing population, which they're paid much more. They're much more expensive, and the level of care that their clients need is even higher, because the unskilled people are they're being nannies, and they're keeping an eye on grandma, make sure she's fed. The nurses actually have people who are unhealthy or debilitated and really need a lot of help, and that's way more expensive. So yeah, there's a lot of money being spent today in addressing these issues, and there aren't enough resources to address the issue well. So I think there's lots of opportunity there.
Wow, if that could have been possible 9 years ago when my son was a baby, to have video AI take care of him. No, I'm kidding. I'm sure it's more for.
Yeah, it's more of an augmentation, right? It's improving the quality, and I have this.
I agree with that.
Making sure they don't run out the door when you're not looking. So that kind of stuff.
Or get something in their mouth or throat, which could be a safety issue as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So lots of ways to improve the current situation.
Excellent.
It's definitely a lot of great ideas, new ways of thinking about this, Dale, that I certainly haven't considered before our conversation today. So really appreciate your time today, Dale, with sharing with us your expertise.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thanks, Dale. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard today and would like to hear more, please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite player like iTunes and Spotify. And please do rate our podcast. Also, please go to our website, www.datatransformerspodcast.com, for more episodes, blogs, and information on our speakers. Thank you.